In the harsh wilderness of 1870s Arizona Territory, where survival meant the difference between life and death with each sunrise, an impossible bond was about to form between two worlds that had been at war for generations. Chief Ayana of the Chiricahua Apache sat in his wickiup, holding his dying infant son whose tiny body grew weaker with each passing hour. The baby had refused all nourishment for 3 days, and the tribal medicine man's remedies had failed. Across the camp, behind guarded posts, sat Martha Henderson, a recently widowed white woman whose own world had been shattered when Apache raiders killed her husband and burned her homestead. She had been taken captive, expecting death, but fate had other plans. What happened next would challenge everything both cultures believed about their enemies, proving that sometimes the most profound healing comes from the most unexpected sources. This is the true story of how a grieving mother's instinct transcended the boundaries of race, war, and hatred, saving not just one Apache baby's life, but ultimately bringing peace between two peoples who had forgotten they shared the same sky, the same earth, and the same capacity for both love and loss. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged landscape of southeastern Arizona Territory as Chief Ayana emerged from his wickiup, his weathered face etched with worry that had deepened over the past 3 days. The Chiricahua Apache camp buzzed with the quiet efficiency of a people who had survived in this harsh land for countless generations, but today an unusual tension hung in the air like the oppressive heat that would soon blanket the desert. Ayana was not a man given to displays of emotion. At 42 years old, he had led his band through countless battles against Mexican soldiers, American cavalry, and rival tribes. His name meant eternal blossom in the Apache tongue, though those who faced him in combat would have found little that was delicate about this imposing figure who stood nearly 6 feet tall with shoulders broadened by years of wielding war clubs and drawing powerful bows. His black hair, streaked with premature silver, hung past his shoulders and was adorned with eagle feathers earned through acts of bravery that had become legend among his people. But today, the great chief felt helpless in a way that no enemy had ever made him feel. His son, born just 6 weeks ago to his beloved wife Itzel, was dying, and there seemed to be nothing anyone could do to save him. The infant, whom they had named Nailnish meaning he works, had been thriving until 3 days ago when he suddenly refused to take milk from his mother's breast. Every attempt to feed him resulted in the baby turning his head away and crying weakly, his small voice growing more feeble with each passing hour. Itzel sat inside their dwelling, tears streaming down her face as she held their son close to her chest. She was 28 years old, with the kind of beauty that had made her the envy of many Apache maidens in her youth. Her long black hair was usually braided with colorful beads and silver ornaments that Ayana had traded for during raids, but now it hung loose and unkempt around her shoulders. Dark circles rimmed her eyes from 3 sleepless nights of trying everything she could think of to make her baby feed. The couple had been blessed with 3 other children, but they had lost 2 in infancy to the harsh realities of desert life and constant warfare. Their surviving daughter, Desba, now 12 years old, watched with wide, frightened eyes as her parents struggled with a crisis that seemed beyond anyone's ability to solve. She had seen death before, as all Apache children did, but the thought of losing her baby brother filled her with a terror she couldn't name. Old Chato, the tribe's medicine man, had tried every remedy he knew. He had burned sacred herbs and chanted prayers to the spirits. He had prepared special teas from plants that had traditionally helped nursing mothers, but the baby continued to refuse all nourishment. The elderly shaman's deeply lined face showed his own confusion and growing desperation. In his 70 years, he had seen many sick children, but never one who simply refused to eat without any apparent physical ailment. As the morning progressed, word spread through the camp about the chief's crisis. Warriors stopped their preparations for a planned hunting expedition to whisper among themselves. Women paused in their daily tasks of grinding corn, weaving baskets, and preparing hides to glance toward Ayana's wickiup with worried expressions. Children who normally ran through the camp with joyful shouts played more quietly, sensing the adults' anxiety. The camp itself was a temporary settlement, as was the way of the Apache. 37 wickiups made from wooden poles and brush dotted the protected valley, chosen for its access to water from a small stream and its defensive positions among the rocks and canyons. The Chiricahua were constantly on the move, staying ahead of the U.S. cavalry that had been pursuing Apache bands with increasing intensity since the end of the Civil War had freed up more troops for the Indian campaigns. It was in this atmosphere of crisis and uncertainty that Ayana found his attention drawn to an unexpected source. Among the captives taken during a raid on a white settlement 2 weeks earlier was a woman named Martha Henderson. Unlike the other prisoners who had been ransomed or integrated into the tribe according to Apache custom, Martha presented a unique situation that had puzzled the tribal council. Martha was 34 years old, a tall woman with auburn hair that had once been carefully pinned up in the style of respectable frontier wives but now hung in tangled waves around her shoulders. Her green eyes held a depth of grief that even the Apache, who were no strangers to loss, could recognize and respect. She had been captured when Apache raiders attacked the small homestead she shared with her husband Robert, a farmer trying to make a living growing vegetables to sell to the nearby mining camps. The raid had been swift and devastating. Robert Henderson had tried to defend his property with an old rifle, but he was no match for seasoned Apache warriors. Martha had watched in horror as her husband of 8 years was killed before her eyes. The raiders had burned their small cabin, destroyed their crops, and taken everything of value, including Martha herself. But what made her situation unusual was that she had recently given birth to a child who had died of fever just 1 week before the raid. Martha's body still carried the physical changes of recent motherhood, though her heart carried the double burden of losing both her husband and her infant daughter within the span of a week. The Apache raiders hadn't known about her recent loss when they took her captive, seeing only a young white woman who might be valuable for ransom or trade. Now, 2 weeks into her captivity, she remained under guard but had been treated according to Apache customs regarding prisoners. The Apache had a complex relationship with captives that differed significantly from the stereotypes believed by most white settlers. While captives taken during warfare could face harsh treatment or death, those taken for other purposes were often integrated into tribal life, especially women and children who could be adopted into Apache families. Martha's situation fell into a gray area that the tribal council had not yet fully decided upon. She was kept in a small wickiup under the watchful eye of an elderly Apache woman named Nate, whose own son had been killed by cavalry soldiers 3 years earlier. Nate spoke some English, learned during her youth when she had lived briefly at a mission, and she had served as Martha's primary guard and, surprisingly, source of basic comfort during the captive's first difficult weeks. Martha's days were filled with the mundane tasks assigned to her, gathering firewood, helping with food preparation, and mending clothing. But her nights were haunted by memories of her husband's death and grief over her lost daughter. She often lay awake listening to the sounds of the Apache camp, trying to make sense of her situation and wondering if she would ever see civilization again, or if she even wanted to after losing everything that had mattered to her. The irony of her situation was not lost on her. Here she was, surrounded by the very people her culture had taught her to fear and hate, yet finding herself treated with a rough kindness that surprised her. The Apache women didn't speak her language well, but they had shared their food with her, given her adequate shelter, and had not subjected her to the cruelty she had expected based on the stories she had heard from other settlers. As Ayana struggled with his son's mysterious illness, he found himself glancing toward the area of the camp where the captives were kept. Something about the white woman's presence nagged at him, though he couldn't identify what it was. Perhaps it was the way she moved with the careful, measured steps of someone carrying a great sorrow, or the way her eyes seemed to hold a depth of understanding about loss that resonated with his own current fears. The chief had originally planned to ransom Martha back to the white authorities or perhaps trade her for Apache prisoners held by the army. Such exchanges were not uncommon, though they were becoming more difficult to arrange as tensions escalated between the Apache and the ever-expanding American presence in the territory. But now, with his son's life hanging in the balance and traditional remedies failing, Ayana found himself considering possibilities that would have seemed unthinkable just days before. Martha had noticed the unusual activity around the chief's dwelling and the somber mood that had settled over the camp. Through Nate's limited English and her own growing ability to understand basic Apache words, she had learned that the chief's baby was very sick and refusing to eat. The news stirred something deep within her, a maternal instinct that her recent losses had not been able to extinguish. During her captivity, Martha had observed the Apache way of life with the keen eye of someone whose survival might depend on understanding her captors. She had seen how deeply these people loved their children, how the entire community came together to protect and nurture the young ones. It was not so different from the farming community she had known back in Missouri before she and Robert had ventured west seeking a new life. She had also observed the Apache women nursing their babies and had felt a physical response that reminded her painfully of her own recent motherhood. Her body had not yet forgotten its biological purpose, and seeing other infants stirred both grief for her own lost child and an instinctive desire to nurture that she thought had died with her daughter. As the third day of the crisis wore on, Ayanna made a decision that surprised even himself. He sought out Naich and asked her to bring the white woman to speak with him. Such a request was unusual, as captives typically had no direct contact with the chief unless their status was being formally decided by the tribal council. Naich found Martha sitting by the stream that ran through the camp, staring at the water as it flowed over smooth stones worn down by countless seasons of rain and snowmelt. Her hands were idle in her lap, a rare occurrence for someone who had been raised to believe that busy hands were virtuous hands. The older Apache woman approached cautiously, unsure how to explain the chief's unusual request. "Chief wants speak with you," Naich said in her halting English, gesturing toward Ayanna's wickiup. "You come now." Martha looked up, her green eyes showing a flicker of fear mixed with resignation. She had been expecting this moment, assuming that her fate would eventually be decided and that the decision might not be in her favor. She stood slowly, brushing dust from her torn and patched dress, and followed Naich through the camp. As they walked, Martha was aware of the eyes watching her. Apache children peeked out from behind their mothers' skirts, having been taught to be wary of white people from an early age. Warriors paused in their activities to observe this unusual procession. She kept her head up and her shoulders straight, determined to maintain whatever dignity she could, regardless of what awaited her. Ayanna stood outside his dwelling, and Martha was struck by the change in his appearance since she had first seen him during the raid 2 weeks ago. Then, he had been a terrifying figure of authority and power, painted for war and radiating the confidence of a successful leader. Now, she saw a father consumed by worry, his usual commanding presence softened by fear for his child. The transformation made him seem more human, more relatable than the savage enemy she had been conditioned to see. The chief gestured for Martha to sit on a woven mat near the entrance of his wickiup, while he settled cross-legged across from her. For a long moment, neither spoke, each taking the measure of the other in this unprecedented situation. Finally, Ayanna spoke in Apache to Naich, who translated his words with obvious uncertainty about the wisdom of what was being discussed. "Chief say his baby very sick," Naich explained. "Baby no eat for 3 days. Medicine man try everything, but baby still no eat. Chief think maybe." She paused, struggling to find the right English words. "Chief think maybe you help." Martha's eyebrows rose in surprise. This was not what she had expected at all. "Help how?" she asked, though a part of her was already beginning to understand what might be behind this extraordinary request. Ayanna spoke again, his voice low and urgent. Naich listened intently, then turned back to Martha with an expression of deep uncertainty. "Chief say you have baby not long ago. He think maybe you can help his baby eat. Apache way and white way may be different, but baby need eat or baby die." The request hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire, heavy with implications that none of them fully understood. Martha felt her heart begin to race as she considered what was being asked of her. The irony was overwhelming. Here was her captor, her enemy according to everything she had been taught, asking her to help save his child's life. The very man whose warriors had killed her husband was now placing his most precious possession, his son's life, in her hands. But, beyond the irony lay something deeper and more complex. Martha's body responded to the idea of nursing a baby with a mixture of longing and pain that took her breath away. Her maternal instincts, so recently awakened and then brutally severed by loss, stirred to life with an intensity that surprised her. At the same time, she felt a strange sense of justice in the situation. Perhaps this was an opportunity to save a life after having lost so much, to nurture and protect instead of merely surviving. "I don't know if I can help," Martha said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm willing to try." Ayanna's relief was visible even before Naich translated Martha's response. For the first time in 3 days, the chief's expression showed a glimmer of hope. He stood and gestured toward the entrance of his wickiup, inviting Martha to enter the sacred space where his family lived and where his son lay fighting for life. As Martha rose to follow him, she realized that she was about to cross more than just the threshold of an Apache dwelling. She was stepping into a situation that would challenge everything she believed about her captors, about herself, and about the possibilities for understanding between two peoples who had been taught to see each other as nothing more than enemies to be destroyed. Martha's first step into Chief Ayana's wickiup felt like entering another world entirely. The dwelling was larger than the simple shelter she had been assigned, with carefully arranged buffalo hides covering the ground and personal belongings organized along the curved walls. The air carried the scent of sage and wood smoke, mixed with something else she couldn't identify but which seemed to speak of family and belonging in a way that made her chest tighten with memory. Itzel sat in the far corner, cradling her baby son against her chest. When she looked up at Martha's entrance, her dark eyes showed the raw desperation of a mother watching her child fade away. The baby's weak crying had diminished to barely audible whimpering, and his tiny hands moved feebly as he turned his head away from his mother's breast once again. Martha knelt slowly beside Itzel, their eyes meeting across a gulf of language and culture that suddenly seemed less important than the shared understanding of motherhood. Without words, Itzel extended her arms, offering her most precious possession to this white stranger in a gesture of trust that defied everything both their peoples had taught them about the other. The baby was smaller than Martha had expected, his skin a warm bronze color that reminded her of autumn leaves. His black hair was soft as silk beneath her fingers as she carefully took him into her arms. For a moment, the weight of him against her chest brought back such a flood of memory and physical response that she had to close her eyes and breathe deeply to maintain her composure. The infant's eyes fluttered open, revealing dark pupils that seemed to look directly at her with an intensity unusual for one so young. His crying stopped almost immediately, replaced by a quietness that might have been alarming if not for the fact that he seemed alert and aware rather than listless. Martha felt her body responding in ways she had thought were gone forever, the biological imperative of motherhood awakening despite the tragic circumstances that had brought her to this moment. "Hello, little one," she whispered in English, knowing the baby couldn't understand her words but hoping he might respond to the gentle tone. "I know you're hungry. Let's see if we can help you find what you need." Ayana and Itzel watched in tense silence as Martha adjusted her position, making herself comfortable on the soft hides. She had nursed her own daughter for the brief weeks of the infant's life and knew the importance of being relaxed and calm. The baby settled against her naturally, his instincts seeming to recognize what was being offered even before Martha had fully arranged herself. When the baby began to nurse, the relief in the wickiup was palpable. Itzel let out a sob of joy that she quickly stifled with her hand, while Ayana's entire posture relaxed for the first time in days. The infant fed eagerly, his small hands pressing against Martha's chest as he took the nourishment his body had been refusing from his own mother. Old Shadow, who had been waiting anxiously outside, entered the dwelling just as the feeding began. His weathered face showed amazement and confusion in equal measure. In all his years as a medicine man, he had never encountered a situation quite like this one. According to Apache beliefs about spiritual medicine and the power of mothers, what was happening should not have been possible. Yet here was clear evidence that sometimes the spirits worked in ways that defied traditional understanding. As the minutes passed and the baby continued to feed successfully, a quiet conversation began between Ayana and his wife in their native language. Martha couldn't understand the words, but she could sense the mixture of relief, gratitude, and bewilderment in their voices. Nate, who had remained nearby to translate if needed, seemed as stunned as anyone by this turn of events. The feeding session lasted nearly an hour, far longer than any of the baby's recent attempts with his mother. When he finally released his hold and fell into a peaceful sleep against Martha's chest, the change in his appearance was already visible. His color seemed better, and his breathing was deeper and more regular than it had been in days. Martha looked up to find everyone in the wickiup staring at her with expressions she couldn't quite interpret. There was gratitude, certainly, but also something else. Perhaps it was the beginning of a recognition that the boundaries between peoples might not be as absolute as they had all believed. She carefully transferred the sleeping baby back to his mother's arms, noting how Itzel's hands trembled slightly as she reclaimed her son. "He's beautiful," Martha said softly, knowing that Itzel probably wouldn't understand the words but hoping the tone would convey her meaning. "Strong, like his father." Ayana surprised everyone, including himself, by responding in halting English. You saved my son," he said, the words clearly difficult for him to form. "Why you help Apache baby when Apache take everything from you?" The question hung in the air, and Martha found herself considering it seriously. Why had she agreed to help? Was it simple human compassion, or something deeper? "Because he's a baby," she said finally. "Babies don't choose to be born into war. They just need love and care to survive." Nate translated Martha's response, and Martha watched as Ayana's expression grew thoughtful. The chief was clearly grappling with concepts that challenged his understanding of white people and their motivations. In his experience, whites were driven by greed for land and gold, willing to destroy anything and anyone who stood in their way. The idea that a white woman would risk her own safety to help an Apache child seemed to contradict everything he thought he knew about his enemies. As the day wore on, word of what had happened spread through the camp with the speed of wildfire. Warriors who had been preparing for a hunting expedition found themselves distracted by discussions of this unprecedented event. Women gathering around the communal fire pit spoke in hushed tones about the strange turn their captive had taken. Children who had been taught to fear and hate white people now whispered questions about the woman who had helped their chief's baby. The tribal council, consisting of the band's senior warriors and wise men, requested an emergency meeting to discuss the implications of what had occurred. Such a meeting was unusual, as most tribal business was conducted during the regular evening gatherings. But the circumstances were extraordinary enough to warrant immediate attention. Martha found herself back in her assigned dwelling, under Nature's watchful eye, but aware that her status in the camp had shifted in ways she didn't fully understand. The older Apache woman seemed torn between her traditional role as guard and a growing sense of something approaching respect for her charge. "What happened today very strange," Nate said in her careful English as they sat together outside the wickiup. "In all my years, never see white woman help Apache baby like family. Make people think different thoughts about white people, about you." Martha nodded, understanding that she had crossed some invisible line that couldn't be uncrossed. "I don't know what happens next," she admitted. "But I couldn't let a baby suffer when I might be able to help." Meanwhile, in his own dwelling, Ayana held his son and marveled at the change in the infant's condition. The baby had slept peacefully for several hours and had awakened alert and hungry, taking milk from his mother for the first time in days. Whatever had been wrong seemed to be resolved, at least temporarily. But the chief's mind was occupied with questions that went far beyond his son's immediate health. The white woman's actions had challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of their conflict with the Americans. If a white woman could show such compassion for an Apache child, what did that say about the possibility of understanding between their peoples? Itzel, too, was struggling with conflicting emotions. Her relief at her son's recovery was overwhelming, but it was complicated by the debt she now owed to someone her culture had taught her to consider an enemy. The woman who had saved her child was the same type of person whose settlements the Apache raided for survival, whose soldiers hunted Apache families across the desert. As evening approached, the tribal council gathered around the central fire pit for their emergency session. The flames cast dancing shadows on the faces of men who had spent their lives fighting to preserve their way of life against an ever-expanding wave of white settlement. They were practical men who had to make decisions based on survival and the protection of their people, but today they found themselves grappling with philosophical questions that had no easy answers. Shadow spoke first, his voice carrying the authority of age and spiritual knowledge. He described what he had witnessed in the chief's wickiup, emphasizing the seemingly miraculous nature of the baby's recovery. In Apache spiritual understanding, such events were never merely physical but carried deeper meaning about the balance of forces in the world. The old medicine man suggested that the white woman might possess special spiritual power, perhaps sent by the spirits to teach the Apache something important. This interpretation was met with skeptical murmurs from some of the younger warriors, who saw any suggestion of spiritual significance in a white person's actions as dangerously naive. Geronimo, Ayana's war chief and closest advisor, argued for a more practical interpretation. The woman had simply done what any mother would do when faced with a suffering child. Her actions, while unexpected, didn't change the fundamental reality of the war between Apache and white settlers. To read too much meaning into one act of compassion would be to risk losing sight of the larger struggle for survival. But other voices offered different perspectives. Some argued that the woman's actions proved that not all whites were the same, that perhaps there were individuals among their enemies who could be reasoned with, who possessed the same basic human values that the Apache cherished. This viewpoint was particularly appealing to those who were growing weary of constant warfare and the toll it was taking on Apache families. The debate continued for hours, with passionate arguments on all sides. Some council members wanted to release Martha immediately as a gesture of gratitude for her service to the chief's family. Others argued for maintaining the status quo, keeping her as a valuable captive who might be used for ransom or prisoner exchange. A few suggested that her apparent spiritual power made her too valuable to release but too dangerous to keep as a prisoner. While the council debated her fate, Martha found herself thinking about the events of the day and what they might mean for her future. She had acted on instinct and compassion, not calculating any potential benefit to herself. But now she realized that her actions might have consequences far beyond the immediate relief of helping a sick baby. For the first time since her capture, Martha found herself genuinely uncertain about whether she wanted to return to white civilization. What waited for her there? A burned homestead, a husband's grave, and memories of a lost child. The life she had known was gone forever, destroyed as completely as if she had died alongside Robert. Here, in this Apache camp, she had found a purpose again, even if it was temporary. The feeling of a baby nursing at her breast had awakened something in her that she thought had died with her daughter. For a few hours, she had felt like a mother again instead of just a grieving widow. That night, as the camp settled into the quiet rhythms of sleep, unusual sounds could be heard from the chief's dwelling. Instead of the weak cries that had troubled everyone for days, there were the normal sounds of a healthy baby, the soft murmurs of parents discussing their child, and the peaceful breathing of a family finally able to rest. Martha lay awake in her own shelter, staring up at the stars visible through the smoke hole at the top of the wickiup. The same stars had shone down on her farm in Missouri, on her burning homestead, and now on this Apache camp where she had somehow become more than just a captive. She wondered if Robert could see her now, if he would understand the choice she had made to help their former enemies. The baby's crying in the distance had stopped, but Martha's thoughts continued to race. She had crossed a line today that couldn't be uncrossed, had formed a connection that transcended the boundaries of war and hatred. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions, but tonight she allowed herself to feel something she hadn't experienced since her capture, a sense that she might have found a place where she belonged. In the chief's wickiup, Ayanna lay beside his sleeping wife and son, his mind wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. The white woman's actions had saved his child, but they had also opened a door to possibilities he had never considered. Could there be a future where Apache and white people lived in peace? Was it possible that understanding could grow from acts of simple human kindness? These thoughts troubled him because they suggested that the war he had been fighting might have solutions beyond victory or defeat. If a white woman could love an Apache child enough to risk her safety to save him, what other boundaries might be crossed with enough courage and wisdom? As sleep finally claimed the camp, the seeds of change had been planted in ways that no one fully understood. A baby's hunger had been satisfied, but, in the process, much larger hungers for understanding and peace had been awakened in hearts that had known only war. The dawn of the fourth day brought with it a transformation that went far beyond the chief's recovering son. Word of the previous day's events had spread beyond the immediate camp through the complex network of Apache communications, reaching other bands scattered across the vast territories of Arizona and New Mexico. Runners had carried news of the white woman who had saved an Apache baby, and the story grew in significance with each telling. Martha woke to find her circumstances subtly but unmistakably changed. Nate approached her with a different demeanor, no longer the wary guard watching a potentially dangerous captive but something approaching a companion. The older woman brought fresh water for washing and clean clothing that had been prepared by the camp's women, garments that were distinctly Apache in style but carefully sized to fit Martha's taller frame. "Chief wants see you again," Nate explained as Martha examined the beautifully crafted dress with its intricate beadwork and soft deerskin material. "Baby need eat again, but more than that, Chief need talk with you about important things." As Martha changed into the Apache clothing, she caught a glimpse of herself in the small mirror that Nate carried, one of the few possessions the older woman had managed to keep through years of conflict and displacement. The face looking back at her seemed like that of a stranger. Her auburn hair, now braided in the Apache style with small feathers and beads that the women had woven in, framed features that had grown leaner during her weeks of captivity. But it was her eyes that showed the most dramatic change. Where once there had been the hollow despair of fresh grief, now there was something that might have been the beginning of hope. When Martha arrived at Ayana's wickiup, she found the scene much different from the crisis atmosphere of the previous day. The baby was alert and nursing successfully from his mother, his small hands grasping at Eitzel's hair as he fed with the vigor of a healthy infant. The relief on both parents' faces was evident, but Martha could see something else in their expressions as well, a complex mixture of gratitude, confusion, and what might have been the beginning of genuine respect. Ayana gestured for Martha to sit, and this time their conversation included more participants. Several members of the tribal council had joined them, including Old Chato and War Chief Geronimo. The presence of these important men indicated that Martha's status had evolved far beyond that of a simple captive awaiting ransom or exchange. "My son lives because of you," Ayana began, speaking slowly in English that was becoming more confident with each sentence. "This creates debt between us that cannot be paid with horses or weapons. In Apache way, life debt is sacred thing, more important than tribal loyalty or war." Chato spoke next, his words requiring translation from Nate since he knew no English. "Medicine man say what happened yesterday not normal thing. He say spirits chose you to save Apache baby, and spirits not make mistakes. He think maybe you meant to be here, maybe Great Spirit have plan we do not understand." The implications of the medicine man's interpretation were staggering. In Apache culture, spiritual signs and interventions were taken with the utmost seriousness. If the tribal spiritual leader believed that Martha's presence and actions were part of some larger divine plan, it would fundamentally alter how the entire band viewed her and her future with them. Martha listened to the translation with growing amazement. She had been raised in a Christian household where divine intervention was acknowledged but rarely experienced so directly. The idea that Apache spiritual beliefs might encompass her actions and their cosmic understanding was both humbling and overwhelming. "I don't know about spirits or divine plans," Martha responded carefully. "I only know that when I heard your son crying, my heart told me I had to try to help." Any mother would have done the same thing. When Nate translated her response, it sparked an animated discussion among the Apache men in their own language. Martha caught fragments of words and could sense the intensity of the debate even without understanding the specific content. Finally, Geronimo spoke directly to her in broken but understandable English. "White woman say any mother would help, but this not true," he said, his weathered face serious. "Apache women captured by white soldiers not treated with kindness. Apache children taken from families and sent to white schools where they forbidden to speak Apache language or follow Apache ways. White people usually see Apache as animals, not human beings deserving of compassion." The war chief's words struck Martha with the force of uncomfortable truth. She realized that her actions were remarkable not because helping a sick child was unusual, but because helping an Apache child was unprecedented in her world. The revelation forced her to confront the depth of hatred and prejudice that existed between the two peoples, prejudices that she herself had held without question until recent events had challenged them. "Maybe that's the problem," Martha said after a long moment of reflection. "Maybe we've all forgotten that mothers are mothers, regardless of the color of their skin or the language they speak. Maybe we've forgotten that children are children, innocent of the wars their parents fight." Her words, translated by Nate, created another stir of discussion among the Apache men. Martha could see that she was articulating thoughts that some of them had perhaps considered but never dared to voice. The possibility that the fundamental humanity shared between Apache and white people might be stronger than their differences was a radical concept with revolutionary implications. As the morning progressed, Martha found herself engaged in the most extraordinary conversation of her life. Through Nate's translations and Ayana's improving English, she began to learn about Apache history, culture, and perspectives on the conflict that had consumed both peoples for decades. The stories she heard challenged everything she thought she knew about who was responsible for the violence and who had suffered most from it. She learned about broken treaties and promises made by American officials only to be violated when gold or good farmland was discovered on Apache territory. She heard about Apache children kidnapped and forced into white schools where they were beaten for speaking their native language. She discovered that many Apache raids on white settlements were desperate attempts to rescue stolen family members or to obtain food for starving communities pushed off their traditional hunting grounds. But the conversation was not one-sided. The Apache men also listened as Martha described the fears and experiences of white settlers, many of whom were simply families seeking better lives in the West. She told them about communities terrorized by Apache raids, about women and children killed or captured during attacks on isolated homesteads, about the cycle of revenge and retaliation that had consumed both peoples. As the hours passed, something unprecedented was happening. Natural enemies were beginning to see each other as human beings rather than faceless threats. The conversation was painful and difficult, forcing all participants to confront uncomfortable truths about their own people's actions and motivations. But it was also liberating, offering the first glimpse of a possible future where understanding might replace hatred. Little Nailnish, meanwhile, continued to thrive. He had nursed successfully from Martha twice more, and each feeding seemed to strengthen not only the baby but also the bonds forming between the adults around him. Itzel had begun attempting to communicate with Martha through gestures and the few English words she was learning, creating a friendship that transcended language barriers. The change in the baby's health had practical implications that extended beyond the emotional impact. As the son of the chief, Nailnish's well-being was seen as an indicator of the band's spiritual health and future prospects. His recovery was interpreted by many as a sign that the spirits favored new approaches to old problems, that perhaps the traditional ways of dealing with white encroachment needed to be reconsidered. During the afternoon, Martha was invited to participate in the camp's daily life in ways that went far beyond her previous status as captive. She helped the women prepare meals, learning Apache techniques for preserving meat and preparing traditional foods. She watched as children played games that taught them hunting and survival skills, noting how similar their laughter and energy were to white children she had known. Most significantly, she was asked to join the evening meal shared by the chief's family, an honor that would have been unthinkable just days before. As she sat around the small fire inside Ayana's wickiup, sharing food and watching the interplay between husband, wife, and children, Martha realized that she was witnessing something that few white people had ever seen: Apache family life in its natural, unguarded state. The family dynamics were remarkably familiar despite the cultural differences. Ayana showed the same protective instincts and tender concern for his children that Martha had seen in her own father and husband. Itzel displayed the same mixture of nurturing care and gentle firmness that characterized good mothers everywhere. 12-year-old Desba exhibited the same combination of growing independence and lingering childishness that marked adolescence in any culture. As the evening progressed, Martha found herself telling stories about her own family and background, describing life on a Missouri farm and the dreams that had brought her and Robert West to Arizona territory. Through Nature's translations, she shared memories of her lost daughter and the grief that had nearly destroyed her. The Apache family listened with respectful attention, offering the same type of comfort and sympathy they would have given to one of their own people experiencing loss. When it came time for Nailnish's evening feeding, there was no longer any awkwardness about the arrangement. Martha held the baby naturally, settling into a comfortable position as if she had been caring for him all his life. As he nursed contentedly, she felt the same surge of maternal fulfillment that she had experienced the day before, but now it was accompanied by something else, a growing sense of belonging. That night, as the camp settled into sleep, conversations continued in many of the wickiups. The presence of a white woman who had saved the chief's son was forcing individual Apache families to reconsider their beliefs about their enemies. Children who had been taught to fear and hate all white people were now confused by the existence of someone who clearly cared about Apache children. Adults were grappling with the possibility that their understanding of the conflict might be incomplete. Martha's sleeping arrangements had also evolved. Instead of the guarded isolation of her first weeks in captivity, she now shared quarters with Nate in a relationship that had become more protective than restrictive. The older Apache woman had begun teaching her more complex elements of the language and customs, treating her more like a relative learning tribal ways than a prisoner being monitored for escape attempts. As Martha lay on the soft hides that served as her bed, she reflected on the extraordinary transformation of her circumstances. Just weeks ago, she had been a grieving widow with nothing left to live for. Now she found herself at the center of what might become a historic shift in relations between two warring peoples. The responsibility was daunting, but it was also energizing in a way she hadn't experienced since losing her family. The baby's soft breathing from the nearby wickiup served as a reminder of what had started this chain of events. A child's need had transcended the boundaries of war and hatred, creating connections that might prove stronger than the forces that had kept Apache and white people apart. But Martha was also aware that they had taken only the first tentative steps on what would undoubtedly be a long and difficult journey toward understanding. Outside the camp, the larger war continued. Cavalry patrols still searched for Apache bands to destroy or relocate to reservations. Apache war parties still raided white settlements for supplies and revenge. The transformation occurring within this small band was occurring in isolation from the broader conflict that continued to rage across the Southwest. But, within the protective circle of wickiups, something extraordinary was growing. A white woman and an Apache family were learning to see each other as human beings rather than enemies. A baby's hunger had become the catalyst for connections that might eventually help heal the wounds between two peoples who had forgotten their shared humanity. As sleep finally claimed the camp, the future remained uncertain but filled with new possibilities that had been unimaginable just days before. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions, but tonight offered hope that understanding might indeed prove stronger than hatred, that love might transcend the boundaries created by fear and prejudice. 2 weeks after little Nailnish had first successfully nursed from Martha Henderson, the Apache camp had settled into a new rhythm that would have seemed impossible to any outside observer. The white woman who had arrived as a captive had become something unprecedented in the long history of Apache-white relations, a bridge between two worlds that had known only conflict for generations. Martha's daily routine now included regular feeding sessions with the chief's son, who had grown visibly stronger and more alert under her care. But her role had expanded far beyond that of a wet nurse. She had become an informal advisor to Chief Ayana on matters relating to white settlements and military tactics, sharing knowledge that proved invaluable to Apache survival strategies. Her understanding of white customs and thinking patterns provided insights that helped the band avoid confrontations and identify opportunities for peaceful trade. The transformation in Martha herself was equally remarkable. The broken, grieving widow who had been captured during the raid had been replaced by a woman with purpose and belonging. Her Apache language skills had improved dramatically through daily immersion, and she could now conduct basic conversations without Nature's translation assistance. More importantly, she had begun to think like an Apache, understanding the survival mentality and community bonds that held the band together in the face of constant external threats. On this particular morning, Martha was helping Eatsell prepare traditional Apache foods when a commotion at the camp's perimeter announced the arrival of visitors. A small party of Apache warriors from a neighboring band had come with urgent news that would test the fragile peace Martha had found and the relationships she had built. The visitors' leader was a man named Victorio, whose reputation as a fierce war chief was known throughout Apache territory. He had come to speak with Ayana about forming an alliance for a major offensive against the white settlements that had been expanding along the Rio Grande. His plan involved coordinating attacks from multiple Apache bands to drive the settlers back and reclaim traditional Apache hunting grounds. Martha watched from a distance as Victorio addressed Ayana and the assembled warriors, his passionate words carrying clearly across the camp despite her imperfect understanding of the Apache language. She could see the effect his speech was having on the young warriors, their faces lighting up with the prospect of striking back against their enemies rather than constantly running and hiding. But Martha could also see the conflict in Ayana's expression. The chief was no coward, and, under normal circumstances, he would have been eager to join such an alliance. However, his recent interactions with Martha had complicated his view of the conflict in ways that made simple solutions less appealing. When the formal council meeting began that evening, Martha was surprised to find herself invited to attend. Her presence at such a gathering was unprecedented, as Apache war councils were traditionally restricted to proven warriors and tribal elders. But Ayana had insisted that her perspective might be valuable, given her knowledge of white settlements and military capabilities. Victorio's presentation was impressive and thorough. He had maps drawn on treated hide showing the locations of vulnerable settlements, detailed intelligence about military patrol patterns, and a comprehensive strategy for coordinated attacks that would maximize damage while minimizing Apache casualties. His plan called for striking 6 different settlements simultaneously, creating panic and confusion that would force the military to spread their forces thin. "The white men grow stronger every season," Victorio declared in a voice that carried the authority of countless battles. "More soldiers come from the east. More settlers take our land. If we do not act now with united strength, our children will know only reservation life, forbidden to hunt or live as Apache. This is our chance to remind them that we are still warriors, still free men who will not be driven from our homeland." The war chief's words stirred obvious enthusiasm among many of the younger Apache men. Martha could see heads nodding in agreement and hands moving unconsciously toward weapons. The appeal to Apache pride and freedom was powerful, and Victorio's reputation as a successful war leader gave weight to his arguments. But, when Victorio noticed Martha's presence at the council, his tone changed dramatically. "Why does a white woman sit in our war council?" he demanded, his eyes flashing with anger. "Has Ayanna forgotten that we are planning war against her people? Does he trust our enemies to hear our strategies?" The question created an immediate tension that Martha could feel from across the circle. Several warriors shifted uncomfortably, and she could see doubt beginning to appear on faces that had recently looked at her with acceptance and respect. The fundamental contradiction of her position had been brought into stark focus. How could she be trusted with Apache war plans when those plans involved attacking white settlements? Ayanna rose to defend his decision to include Martha in the council. "This woman saved my son's life when Apache medicine failed. She has lived among us for weeks without betraying our trust. She knows white ways and white thinking better than any of us. Her counsel could prevent many Apache deaths." "Her counsel could also warn the white soldiers of our plans," Victorio countered. "How do we know she will not escape and carry word to the cavalry? How do we know this is not all an elaborate trick to learn our strategies and locations?" The debate that followed was intense and personal, forcing the entire council to confront questions about loyalty, trust, and the nature of their conflict with white settlers. Martha sat in silence, understanding that her fate and possibly her life hung in the balance of this discussion. But, more than her personal safety, she was concerned about the impact this conflict might have on the relationships she had built and the fragile bridges of understanding that had been constructed. Old Shadow spoke with the authority of spiritual wisdom, reminding the council that Martha's actions had been interpreted as spiritually significant. "The spirits do not make mistakes," he said. "If they brought this woman to us at the moment of the chief's son's greatest need, perhaps they have larger purposes that we cannot yet see. Perhaps she is meant to be here for this discussion, for this decision." Geronimo, who had initially been skeptical of Martha but had grown to respect her insights, offered a practical perspective. "The woman knows things about white settlements that could save Apache lives. She understands how white soldiers think, how they move, how they can be avoided. But, more than this, she has seen our ways and knows we are not the savages white people believe us to be. Perhaps her knowledge can help us find paths other than war." The suggestion that there might be alternatives to Victorio's war plan was not well received by the visiting warriors. They had come expecting eager allies for their campaign, not philosophical discussions about peaceful solutions. The debate grew heated as fundamental questions about Apache survival strategies were debated with passionate intensity. Martha finally asked for permission to speak, a request that was granted after much discussion. Standing before the council of warriors, she felt the weight of history on her shoulders as she prepared to address the assembled Apache leaders. "I understand your anger," she began, speaking slowly in her improving Apache and relying on Nate to translate the more complex concepts. "White settlers have taken much from you, just as your raids have taken much from white families like mine. But I have learned things living among you that my people need to understand. You are not the savages we have been told you are. You love your children as much as we love ours. You grieve for your dead as deeply as we grieve for ours." She paused, gathering courage for what she knew would be her most controversial statement. "If you attack those settlements, you will kill people who have never harmed an Apache, people who have children and families just like yours. And you will bring down upon yourselves a revenge that will be terrible beyond imagination. More soldiers will come. More Apache families will be destroyed. The cycle of killing will continue until one of our peoples is completely destroyed. Victorio's response was immediate and angry. Pretty words from a white woman who would protect her people by making Apache weak. You speak of cycles of killing, but your people started this war when they came to steal our land. Every dead white settler means fewer threats to Apache children. But what if there was another way? Martha pressed on, knowing she was risking everything but feeling compelled to voice thoughts that had been growing during her weeks with the band. What if some white people could learn to live in peace with Apache? What if we could find ways to share this land instead of fighting over every piece of it? The suggestion was met with skeptical murmurs from many of the warriors, but Martha could see that some were at least considering her words. Chief Ayana in particular seemed intrigued by the possibility she was describing. I have lived among white settlements, Martha continued. Not all whites hate Apache. Many are simply afraid because they have heard stories of raids and violence. They react with fear because they do not understand Apache ways or reasons for fighting. If they could meet Apache families, see Apache children playing and learning, perhaps they would not be so quick to support war. Victorio stood abruptly, his face dark with anger. This woman fills your heads with impossible dreams while white soldiers hunt our families. There can be no peace while whites believe they own everything they see. The only language they understand is strength. The only way to earn their respect is to make them fear Apache warriors. The war chief's words resonated with many of the younger men, who had grown up knowing only conflict and had little hope for peaceful solutions. But older warriors, tired of constant warfare and the toll it was taking on their families, seemed more receptive to the possibility of alternatives. As the debate continued deep into the night, Martha realized that she had become the catalyst for a fundamental discussion about Apache future directions. Her presence and her words had forced the council to consider options beyond the traditional choice between fighting and fleeing. For the first time, they were discussing the possibility of coexistence with white settlers. But she also understood the enormous obstacles to any peaceful resolution. The hatred between the peoples ran deep, fed by years of atrocities committed by both sides. Economic pressures driving white expansion into Apache territory seemed unstoppable. Military and political leaders on both sides had built careers on the conflict and had little incentive to seek peace. When the council finally broke up near dawn, no final decision had been made about Victorio's alliance proposal. Chief Ayana had requested time to consider all the options and to discuss the matter further with his own people. Victorio agreed to wait 3 days for an answer, but his impatience and disappointment were obvious. As the visiting warriors made camp outside the main settlement, Martha found herself once again under subtle guard. The questions raised about her loyalty had reminded everyone that her position remained fundamentally ambiguous. She was no longer a simple captive, but neither was she fully trusted as a member of the band. That morning, as she fed little Nailnish, Martha reflected on the impossible situation she found herself in. She had spoken against the war plan because she genuinely believed it would lead to disaster for the Apache people she had come to care about. But she also knew that her opposition might be seen as evidence that her primary loyalty remained with white settlers. The baby nursed contentedly, unaware of the momentous decisions being debated around him. His healthy growth had been the foundation for everything that had followed, the proof that understanding between Apache and whites was possible. But would that small beginning be enough to overcome the forces pushing toward renewed warfare? As Martha looked into Nailnish's dark eyes, she saw not just an Apache baby but the future of both peoples. The choices made in the next few days would determine whether that future held hope for peace or only continued cycles of violence and revenge. She had found her voice and her purpose among the Apache, but now she faced the greatest challenge yet, helping to chart a course toward a future that neither people had yet imagined possible. The third day of Victorio's visit dawned gray and cold, with storm clouds gathering over the mountains that surrounded the Apache camp. Chief Ayana had called for a final council meeting to announce his decision about the war alliance, and the tension in the air was as thick as the approaching weather. Martha woke knowing that everything she had built during her time with the band might be decided before the sun set. During the past 2 days, she had been excluded from the ongoing discussions between the tribal leaders, but she could sense the division growing within the camp. Some warriors spoke excitedly about joining Victorio's campaign, seeing it as an opportunity to strike back against years of encroachment and broken promises. Others worried about the consequences of such a large-scale attack, fearing that it would bring overwhelming military retaliation against all Apache bands, innocent and guilty alike. Martha spent the morning caring for little Nailnish, who had grown remarkably in the weeks since she had begun nursing him. The baby was now alert and interactive, responding to her voice and touch with the trust and affection typically reserved for family members. As she held him, she reflected on how this tiny life had become the bridge between two worlds, the living proof that love could transcend the artificial boundaries created by war and prejudice. Itzel sat beside her, and the two women had developed enough shared language and understanding to communicate about their concerns for the future. The Apache mother was torn between gratitude for what Martha had done for her family and fear about what her presence might mean for the band's survival. If war came, would Martha's knowledge of Apache locations and strategies put them all in danger? "You worried about council meeting," Itzel observed in her careful English, studying Martha's face with the perceptiveness that came from weeks of close observation. Martha nodded, not trusting herself to speak about the complex emotions churning inside her. She had found belonging and purpose among these people, but she was also keenly aware that her presence had become a complicating factor in their survival decisions. Her insights about white settler behavior and military tactics were valuable, but they came with the implicit threat that she might someday use that knowledge against the Apache people who had welcomed her. "If Ayanna chooses warpath," Itzel continued, "what you do? You warn white soldiers about Apache plans?" The question struck at the heart of Martha's dilemma. Her loyalty to the Apache family that had become her own was genuine and deep, but she also couldn't bear the thought of innocent white settlers being slaughtered in their homes. The ethical complexity of her situation seemed impossible to resolve in any way that wouldn't betray someone she cared about. "I don't know," Martha admitted honestly. "I hope it doesn't come to that choice." As the afternoon approached and the time for the council meeting drew near, Martha was surprised to receive a summons from Chief Ayanna. He wanted to speak with her privately before announcing his decision to the assembled warriors. She found him sitting alone outside his wickiup, staring thoughtfully at the mountains where his ancestors had lived for countless generations. "My son grows strong because of your care," Ayanna said without preamble, his English now confident enough for complex conversations. "But, more than this, my people have learned things from watching you. We have seen that white woman can love Apache baby as her own child. We have seen that enemies can become family if there is will to understand each other." Martha settled beside him, sensing that this conversation would be crucial not just for her future but for the future of the entire band. "Your people have taught me just as much," she replied. "I've learned that Apache families love their children the same way white families do. I've learned that you fight not because you hate white people, but because you love your own people and want to protect them." Ayanna nodded slowly, his withered face showing the weight of leadership decisions that could mean life or death for everyone under his protection. Victorio speaks truth when he says white people grow stronger every season. More soldiers, more settlers, more pressure on Apache lands. If we do nothing, maybe our children live only on reservations, forget Apache ways, become shadows of their ancestors. "But war might end the same way," Martha pointed out gently. "If you attack those settlements, the army will come with more soldiers than you've ever seen. They'll hunt every Apache band until there's nowhere left to hide." The chief was quiet for a long time, considering her words and weighing them against everything he knew about Apache history and survival. Finally, he spoke with the measured tone of a leader who had made a momentous decision. "I have thought much about Third Path, the one you spoke about in council. Path where Apache and white people learn to live without killing each other. Most of my warriors think this impossible dream, but maybe impossible dreams sometimes become possible if brave people willing to try." Martha felt her heart begin to race as she realized what Ayanna might be suggesting. "What kind of third path?" "I will not join Victorio's war," Ayanna announced. "But I will not run to reservations either. Instead, I want to try something that has never been attempted. I want to send messengers to white settlements, to speak of peace, to see if there are white leaders who want to stop fighting as much as some Apache want to stop fighting." The proposal was breathtaking in its audacity and risk. Apache bands that attempted to negotiate peace were often seen as weak by other tribes, making them vulnerable to attack from hostile neighbors. White authorities had historically been unreliable in honoring peace agreements, and there was no guarantee that any settlement would be willing to negotiate with Apache representatives. Who would carry such messages? Martha asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. You would, Ayanna confirmed. You understand both peoples now. You know Apache are not savage monsters. You know white people are not all land-stealing devils. Maybe you can help both sides see truth instead of fear. The magnitude of what he was proposing began to sink in. Martha would essentially become a peace ambassador, carrying messages between Apache bands and white settlements in an attempt to establish dialogue where only warfare had existed before. The role would be dangerous beyond imagination, as she would be trusted fully by neither side and could easily be killed by white soldiers who saw her as a traitor or by Apache warriors who saw her as a spy. Even if I agreed to try, Martha said carefully, what makes you think anyone would listen? White settlements have been attacked so many times that they shoot first and ask questions later when they see Apache. Your own people might see any Apache who wants peace as weak or traitorous. Ayanna smiled for the first time in days, an expression that transformed his stern features and reminded Martha of the father and husband she had come to know during her weeks with his family. You forget something important. You are proof that enemies can become family. White woman who saves Apache baby, Apache family who welcomes white woman as sister. If we can change, maybe others can change too. Before Martha could respond, the sound of gathering voices indicated that the time for the final council meeting had arrived. Ayanna stood and offered his hand to help her rise, a gesture of respect that would have been unthinkable when she had first arrived as a captive. I will announce my decision to reject Victorio's alliance, Ayanna said. Then, I will tell them about the peace path and ask if they will support trying it. But, the choice to carry peace messages must be yours alone. No one can force you to risk your life for something that might fail. As they walked toward the council circle, Martha's mind raced with the implications of what was being offered. She could return to white civilization, but, as what? A widow with nothing left of her former life except painful memories. Or she could accept this unprecedented role as a bridge between worlds, risking everything on the possibility that understanding could triumph over hatred. The council meeting was tense from the moment it began. Victorio and his warriors sat with barely concealed impatience, expecting to hear plans for coordinated attacks and strategies for war. Ayanna's own band gathered with obvious uncertainty, aware that their chief had been struggling with difficult decisions that would affect all their futures. When Ayanna announced that he would not be joining the war alliance, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Victorio leaped to his feet, his face dark with anger and disbelief. You choose the path of cowardice over the path of honor? You abandon Apache brothers who need your warriors to drive back the white invasion? I choose the path of survival over the path of destruction, Ayanna replied calmly. War brings only more war. Dead Apache warriors cannot protect Apache children. There must be another way, and we will try to find it. The debate that followed was passionate and sometimes bitter, with warriors on both sides arguing about survival strategies, honor, and the future of the Apache people. Some of Ayanna's own men questioned his decision, wondering if their chief had been influenced too strongly by the white woman's presence in their camp. But, when Ayanna explained his plan to attempt peace negotiations through Martha as an intermediary, even his critics fell silent with amazement. The audacity of the plan was stunning, and the risks were obvious to everyone. No one could remember any precedent for such an attempt at formal dialogue between Apache bands and white settlements. Victorio's response was harsh and immediate. You send a white woman to make peace while Apache children go hungry because white people steal our hunting grounds? You trust our enemies to keep promises when they have broken every treaty they ever made with our people? This is madness that will bring destruction on all Apache. But Old Shadow surprised everyone by speaking in support of Ayanna's decision. The spirits brought the white woman to save the chief's son when Apache medicine failed, he said with the authority of his spiritual position. Perhaps they brought her for larger purposes. Perhaps she is meant to carry words of peace instead of weapons of war. The debate continued for hours as the storm clouds gathered overhead and the first drops of rain began to fall. Finally, Ayana called for the band to vote on whether they would support his peace initiative. The result was close, but a majority agreed to try the untested path of negotiation before committing to more warfare. Victorio and his warriors departed immediately, their anger and disappointment obvious. As they left, Victorio issued a warning that would prove prophetic: when the white soldiers come to destroy you because you trusted their promises, remember that Apache warriors offered to fight beside you. Remember that you chose words over weapons. As the visitors disappeared into the growing storm, Martha found herself facing the most momentous decision of her life. She looked around at the Apache camp that had become her home, at the family that had welcomed her, at little Nailnish sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms, unaware that his survival had started a chain of events that might change the history of the Southwest. That evening, as rain drummed against the Wickiup walls, Martha gave Ayana her answer. She would accept the role of peace messenger, carrying words between Apache and white communities in an attempt to build understanding where only hatred had existed. The task might be impossible, the risks enormous, but the alternative was continued warfare that could only end in the destruction of one people or both. 3 months later, Martha Henderson stood before a gathering of territorial officials in Tucson, wearing a mixture of Apache and white clothing that symbolized her unique position between worlds. Beside her stood an Apache peace delegation that included Chief Ayana and 2 other band leaders who had joined the unprecedented diplomatic mission. The negotiations that followed were difficult and often frustrating, marked by suspicion and misunderstanding from both sides. But, slowly, carefully, the foundation was laid for the first formal peace agreement between Apache bands and territorial authorities. The treaty established designated areas where Apache families could live and hunt without interference, in exchange for agreements to end raids on white settlements. Not all Apache bands accepted the peace, and not all white communities honored its terms. Victorio proved correct in his prediction that some promises would be broken, some trust would be betrayed. But the precedent had been established that enemies could choose dialogue over warfare, that understanding was possible even between peoples who had known only conflict. Martha never returned to her former life among white settlers, finding instead a new purpose as a permanent intermediary between Apache and white communities. She raised little Nailnish as her own son while also bearing children with an Apache warrior she eventually married. Her unique family became a symbol of the possibility for peace, proof that love could indeed transcend the artificial boundaries created by fear and prejudice. Years later, when historians would write about the end of the Apache Wars in Arizona Territory, they would note the significance of the Henderson Peace Accords, named for the white woman whose courage had made the first dialogues possible. But those who had been there remembered it differently, as the story of how a hungry baby's cry had awakened the conscience of 2 peoples who had forgotten their shared humanity. The lowly Apache chief's baby had refused to feed until a captive white widow moved closer, and, in that simple act of maternal compassion, the seeds of peace had been planted in ground that had known only the bitter harvest of war. Sometimes the greatest changes in history begin with the smallest gestures of love, and sometimes the bridges between worlds are built not by generals or politicians, but by mothers who refuse to let children suffer, regardless of the color of their skin or the language of their tears.